The crystal chandeliers blazed above the Sunningdale ballroom, their 1,000 candles reflecting off polished marble as the winter season's most anticipated ball reached its glittering zenith. But Evangeline Hastings stood frozen in the servants' corridor, her fingers pressed against the doorframe, watching a world that had once been hers slip further away with each passing waltz. At 20, she had learned to make herself invisible, a necessary skill when one's own aunt had transformed her from gentleman's daughter to household drudge. Her gown, a reworked relic salvaged from her mother's old wardrobe, had seemed almost elegant by candlelight in her attic room. Under the merciless brilliance of the ballroom's glow, every mended seam and turned hem proclaimed her fall from grace. She had not meant to come. That was the bitter truth of it. After 3 years of carrying coal scuttles and scrubbing floors in what had once been her own home, Evangeline had learned the cost of wanting things beyond her station. But tonight, watching her cousin Beatrice preen in silk worth more than Evangeline's entire year of labor, something had cracked in the careful armor of her resignation. Just one glimpse, she had told herself. Just one moment to remember what her mother's laughter had sounded like at balls like these, before the fever took her, before father's sudden death left Evangeline in Lady Gertrude's merciless care. The orchestra swelled into a waltz, and Evangeline closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. She could almost feel her father's hand on her shoulder, teaching her the steps in the drawing room while her mother played piano. "You have your mother's grace," he had said. "One day you'll dance at the finest balls in England. There you are, you wretched girl." The voice shattered her reverie like a stone through glass. Evangeline's eyes snapped open to find Lady Gertrude materializing from the crowd, her face a mask of cultivated concern that failed to hide the venom in her eyes. "Aunt, I only meant to." But Lady Gertrude's fingers had already closed around Evangeline's wrist like a manacle, dragging her forward into the ballroom's edge with a grip that would leave bruises. The sudden movement pulled Evangeline from the shadows into the light, and she felt the weight of a dozen gazes turned toward them. "Did you truly believe," Lady Gertrude hissed, her smile savage beneath its veneer of maternal worry, "that you could attend my ball dressed in rags like some scullery maid? You shame the Hastings name, what little remains of it." Evangeline's throat closed. She tried to pull away, but her aunt's grip only tightened, and now more heads were turning, curiosity rippling through the assembled guests like wind across wheat. Lady Pemberton whispered behind her fan. Lord Hertford's eyebrows climbed toward his powdered wig. "Please," Evangeline managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll go." "I shouldn't have." "No, you most certainly should not have." Lady Gertrude's free hand found the fragile lace at Evangeline's shoulder, fingers curling into the delicate fabric. "But since you've chosen to embarrass me before all of society, let us ensure the lesson is thoroughly learned." The sound of tearing fabric echoed like a gunshot in the sudden quiet. Evangeline felt the bodice give way, the ancient silk splitting along her spine with a sound like breaking bones. Cool air rushed against her exposed chemise. Gasps erupted around them, a chorus of scandalized delight. Lady Pemberton's fan snapped open with theatrical precision. Lord Hertford turned away, embarrassed for her. Lady Charlotte Vane's eyes gleamed with the particular satisfaction of witnessing another's humiliation. "You see?" Lady Gertrude announced to their growing audience, her voice carrying across the ballroom with the practiced projection of an actress. "This is what becomes of girls who forget their station. I've housed her from Christian charity since her father's unfortunate passing. Clothed her. Fed her. And she repays me with this mortification, sneaking into a ball where she has no invitation, no sponsor, and clearly no suitable attire. My beautiful family, before we dive into Evangeline's story, please share, like and subscribe to this channel." Evangeline stood paralyzed, one hand clutching the ruined fabric to her chest, the other trembling at her side. The faces surrounding her blurred into a sea of judgment, some pitying, others openly delighted by the scandal unfolding before them. This was what she had become, entertainment for the bored aristocracy, a cautionary tale mothers would tell their daughters about pride and poverty. She should run. Every instinct screamed at her to flee back into the shadows, to disappear into the servants' corridors where she belonged. But her feet had turned to lead, her body refusing to obey even that simple command. "I must ask you to remove yourself immediately," Lady Gertrude continued, her performance reaching its crescendo, "before you cause further embarrassment to those who have shown you nothing but kindness. The Earl of Sunningdale deserves better than to have his hospitality abused by—" "I believe," a voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk, deep and deliberate as a judge's gavel, "the lady's gown is perfectly suitable for a guest in my home." The effect was instantaneous. Conversation died mid-syllable. Fans froze mid-flutter. The crowd parted like water before a ship's prow, revealing the grand staircase and the man descending it with unhurried confidence. Julian Sunningdale, Earl of Sunningdale, moved with the contained grace of a predator who had never needed to rush toward prey. His evening clothes were immaculate, his cravat tied with mathematical precision, but it was his eyes, dark, assessing, missing nothing, that commanded the room's attention. They swept over the scene with clinical detachment. Lady Gertrude's theatrical grip on Evangeline's wrist, the torn dress, the circle of avid spectators, the girl herself standing frozen in the center of it all. Those calculating eyes fixed on Lady Gertrude with an intensity that made the older woman's fingers loosen involuntarily. "Your Grace," Lady Gertrude recovered quickly, executing a curtsy that somehow conveyed both deference and disdain. "I was merely correcting a misunderstanding. My niece was not invited to your magnificent ball, and in her confusion, she appeared in this unfortunate state. I was simply escorting her back to where she might compose herself." Julian descended the final steps with measured deliberation, each footfall a precise punctuation mark in the breathless silence. He stopped directly before Evangeline, his proximity forcing Lady Gertrude to release her grip and step back. Up close, Evangeline could see the sharp intelligence in his dark eyes, the way they catalogued every detail of her appearance, not with pity, but with the cold assessment of a man calculating odds. "How remarkable," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the eager ears surrounding them. "I was certain I sent an invitation to Miss Evangeline Hastings weeks ago. Perhaps it went astray in your household, Lady Gertrude. These things do happen when correspondence passes through multiple hands." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Several guests exchanged knowing glances. It was an open secret that Lady Gertrude managed all affairs of the Hastings household since her brother-in-law's death, including any social correspondence that might elevate her niece above her current station. Lady Gertrude's smile tightened. "My lord, surely there has been some mistake. Evangeline is hardly suited for an event of this caliber. She has been in mourning for her father these 3 years, and her circumstances have necessarily changed. I would not presume to accept invitations on her behalf when she has no proper wardrobe, no chaperone, no freedom, you mean?" The Earl's words fell like stones into still water. The ballroom inhaled collectively. One did not speak so bluntly to a lady of quality, even in defense of another. But Julian Sunningdale had never particularly cared for the ton's delicate sensibilities, and his position was unassailable enough that he could afford the luxury of honesty. Evangeline found her voice at last, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "My lord, I apologize for the disruption. I should not have come. I'll take my leave and—" "You'll do nothing of the sort." His eyes finally left Lady Gertrude's reddening face to meet Evangeline's. There was something in his gaze she couldn't quite name, not kindness exactly, but a fierce protectiveness that seemed oddly at variance with his reputation for cold calculation. "You are my invited guest, Miss Hastings, and you have every right to be here. More right, perhaps, than some others I might name." He extended his hand toward her, palm up. "An invitation. A challenge. a lifeline thrown across the chasm of her humiliation. Evangeline stared at that outstretched hand as if it might dissolve like morning mist. In the periphery of her vision, she could see Lady Pemberton's fan fluttering with renewed vigor, Lord Hertford leaning toward his companion to whisper behind his glove, Lady Charlotte's eyes narrowed with speculation. The entire ballroom had become a theatre, and she stood at center stage with a choice that would define her future. She placed her trembling hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm, solid, anchoring her to something she had thought lost forever. The relief that flooded through her was so intense it left her light-headed. For 3 years, no one had touched her with anything resembling gentleness. No one had defended her. No one had even seen her as anything more than a convenient servant, a burden to be borne with ostentatious charity. Julian drew her hand through his arm with the same ceremony he might show a duchess. "Your gown is torn," he observed, as though discussing the weather. "An unfortunate accident, I'm sure. Lady Gertrude, I trust you'll send for Miss Hastings' maid to attend her? She can retire to the Blue Room to make repairs." It was phrased as a request, but the steel beneath the courtesy was unmistakable. Lady Gertrude's mouth opened, then closed, her face cycling through expressions of outrage and calculation before settling on a mask of wounded dignity. "Of course, Your Grace. Though I must protest that Evangeline has no lady's maid. Her circumstances, as I mentioned, have necessitated certain economies. Then she shall borrow one of mine." Julian's tone brooked no argument. "In fact, I believe my late mother's wardrobe remains largely intact. Miss Hastings appears to be of a similar build. I'm sure something suitable can be found." The whispers erupted in earnest now, no longer bothering with the pretense of discretion. The Earl of Sunningdale offering his mother's clothes to a penniless relation of the Hastings family? The Countess's wardrobe had been legendary, gowns worth fortunes, jewels that could ransom kings. That he would extend such an offer to anyone was extraordinary. That he would extend it to a girl in obvious disgrace was unprecedented. Evangeline felt the weight of every eye in the room, felt the speculation crackling through the air like lightning before a storm. She should refuse. This was too much, too public, too dangerous. Lady Gertrude would make her pay for this humiliation tenfold once they returned home. But home was not home anymore, was it? It was a prison where she scrubbed floors that had once been hers to walk upon freely. "You're too generous, my lord," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Not generous, Miss Hastings. Merely correcting an injustice." He turned to address the assembled crowd, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe congratulations are in order." Evangeline's heart stopped. Surely he didn't mean. "Miss Hastings has done me the extraordinary honor of accepting my proposal of marriage." The ballroom erupted. Lady Pemberton's fan clattered to the floor. Lord Hertford choked on his champagne. Lady Charlotte Vane's mouth fell open in a most unladylike expression of shock. And Lady Gertrude went pale as death, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her like a house built on sand. Evangeline's hand tightened on Julian's arm, whether to steady herself or to confirm this was real, she couldn't say. His eyes met hers again, and she saw the warning there, play along. "Trust me. We'll discuss terms later." She managed a trembling smile and a curtsy to the stunned assembly, even as her mind reeled with the impossibility of what had just occurred. The Earl of Sunningdale, one of England's most eligible bachelors, a man who could have his pick of any woman in the kingdom, had just claimed her as his betrothed. The Blue Room proved to be a sanctuary of silk and silver, far removed from the chaos of the ballroom below. Evangeline stood before the window, watching carriages depart in shocked haste as news of the Earl's stunning announcement sent guests fleeing to spread gossip across London. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened glass, a ghost in a torn gown, still trembling from the aftershocks of her impossible rescue. Behind her, a maid worked in efficient silence, laying out an evening dress of deep sapphire silk across the chaise. The Countess's dress. Evangeline had seen the late Lady Sunningdale once, years ago, a vision of elegance at some garden party her father had attended. The woman had been kind, she remembered. Had pressed a sweet into Evangeline's palm and told her she had beautiful eyes. The door opened without ceremony. Julian entered, then paused, turning his back to allow her modesty while the maid helped her into a dressing gown. "You may go, Martha. Return in 20 minutes to help Miss Hastings dress." The maid curtsied and disappeared like smoke, leaving them alone in a silence that stretched taut as a drawn bowstring. "You're angry," Julian observed, still facing the door. "I'm terrified," Evangeline corrected, her voice sharper than she'd intended. 3 years of forced subservience had not entirely killed the gentleman's daughter within her. "You've just announced to all of London that we're to be married. I don't even know you, my lord. I don't understand what game you're playing, but I cannot." "It's not a game, Miss Hastings. You may look at me now. I'm quite decent." She turned to find him settling into a chair by the fire, his evening coat draped over the arm, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested this conversation had been planned long before tonight's theatrics. He gestured to the chair opposite, an invitation that felt more like a summons. Evangeline sat, clutching the dressing gown closed at her throat. "Then what is it, if not a game? Why would you claim me as your betrothed? The scandal will be extraordinary. People will say I've trapped you, that I'm a fortune hunter, that... Let them say what they wish. I've never particularly cared for society's opinion." Julian leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his dark eyes fixed on hers with unsettling intensity. "Tell me, Miss Hastings, what do you know of your father's business affairs before his death?" The question caught her off balance. Very little. Father managed the estate, the investments. He had interests in shipping, I believe, and some properties in Warwickshire. Yes. Also coal mines in Durham, a textile mill in Manchester, and a rather substantial portfolio of railway shares. Julian's voice took on the crisp efficiency of a solicitor reviewing accounts. "Your father, Miss Hastings, was worth approximately £40,000 at the time of his death. His will stipulated that the entire estate be held in trust for you until your 21st birthday or your marriage, whichever came first. Lady Gertrude was appointed temporary guardian of both you and the fortune." Evangeline's breath caught. £40,000. The number was staggering, impossible. "That can't be right. Aunt Gertrude said father died with debts, that we were nearly destitute, that only her charity." "Your aunt is a liar and a thief." Julian's words fell like an executioner's blade, clean and final. "She has been systematically embezzling from your inheritance for 3 years. The properties have been sold at fractions of their value to her associates. The investments liquidated and transferred to accounts in her name. By my calculations, less than £8,000 remains of your rightful fortune." The room tilted. Evangeline gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles white against the upholstery. "You're mistaken." "She wouldn't. My father trusted her." "She's family." "Your father trusted me as well." Julian rose and moved to a writing desk, returning with a leather portfolio that he placed in her lap. "We were business partners, Miss Hastings. Silent partners in several ventures. When he fell ill, he asked me to keep watch over his affairs, to ensure you were cared for should anything happen to him. I gave him my word." Evangeline opened the portfolio with shaking hands. Inside lay documents, letters in her father's familiar script, ledgers filled with numbers that swam before her eyes. But one letter was addressed to her, sealed with her father's signet ring. "He wrote this a week before he died," Julian said quietly. "He was already suspicious of your aunt's intentions." He asked me to deliver it to you when you came of age, should anything seem amiss with the estate management. She broke the seal with trembling fingers. Her father's words swam on the page through the blur of tears. My dearest Evangeline, if you are reading this, then my worst fears have been realized. Trust Julian Sunningdale. He is a man of honor in a world of charlatans. Your mother loved you beyond measure, as do I. Do not let anyone make you small. You are a Hastings, and we bow to no one. I've been watching your aunt for 3 years, Julian continued, his voice gentle now, as though he understood the earth was shifting beneath her feet. Documenting every transaction, every sale, every fraudulent transfer. But I needed proof that would hold up in Chancery Court, and I needed you to be of legal age to bring the suit. Your 21st birthday is in 4 months. For months, Evangeline whispered. For months of scrubbing floors in her own home. For months of believing herself a burden, a charity case, less than nothing. I had planned to approach you quietly, to offer my legal assistance in recovering your fortune. But when I saw your aunt humiliate you tonight, when I saw her destroy your mother's dress and cast you out like refuse, I realized waiting was no longer an option. Julian's jaw tightened. She would have married you off to some accomplice within weeks. A man who would control both you and whatever remained of the estate. Or worse, she would have had you declared mentally unfit and committed. I've seen the paperwork she's been preparing. Horror crawled up Evangeline's spine. So you've trapped me in a different marriage instead. No. Julian met her eye steadily. I'm offering you a choice, Miss Hastings. A marriage of convenience, in name only. You will have your own rooms, your own life. But you will also have my protection, my legal authority to pursue your aunt through the courts, and access to the evidence I've gathered. Once we've recovered your fortune and seen Lady Gertrude prosecuted for her crimes, you may seek an annulment if you wish. I'll not stand in your way. And if I refuse? If I simply walk away tonight? Then your aunt will destroy you. His words held no malice, only brutal honesty. Within a month, you'll be married to whatever curse she selected, or you'll be in an asylum, or you'll be dead in some convenient accident. She's desperate, Miss Hastings. Desperate people are dangerous. Evangeline looked down at her father's letter, at his familiar hand-forming words of love and warning. We bow to no one. She raised her eyes to Julian's. A marriage in name only. You swear it? On my honor and your father's memory. Then I accept, my lord. Let us make a liar of my aunt and a widow of her schemes. The carriage bearing the Sunningdale crest rolled through the gates of Hastings Manor 3 days after the ball, and Evangeline felt her chest constrict with a pain so acute she pressed her gloved hand against her ribs. Julian, seated across from her with documents spread across his lap, looked up at the sudden intake of breath. We can turn back, he offered quietly. The confrontation can wait. No. Evangeline forced herself to look at the house that had once been her whole world. I need to see it. I need to know what she's done. What had once been pristine Portland stone was now streaked with grime and neglect. Ivy crawled unchecked across the eastern wing, choking the windows her mother had loved for their morning light. The gardens where Evangeline had played as a child had become a wilderness of weeds and dying roses. Even the fountain in the circular drive sat dry and cracked, filled with dead leaves that rustled in the November wind. This was not the gentle decline of a house in mourning. This was deliberate abandonment, the systematic destruction of everything her father had built. The front door opened before they could knock, revealing Mrs. Hodges, the housekeeper who had served the Hastings family for 30 years. The woman's face had aged a decade in 3 years, carved with lines of worry and something that looked like guilt. Her eyes widened at the sight of Evangeline descending from the Earl's carriage in a pelisse of forest green velvet, her hair dressed by a proper lady's maid, a betrothal ring glinting on her finger. Miss Evangeline, Mrs. Hodges breathed, then corrected herself with a curtsy. "My lady. We weren't expecting, that is, Lady Gertrude didn't mention." "Lady Gertrude doesn't know we're coming," Julian said, his tone pleasant but edged with steel. "Is she receiving?" "She's in the morning room, Your Grace. But I should warn you, she's in a temper. The solicitors visited yesterday and there was quite a scene." Julian's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "I imagine there was. Please announce us, Mrs. Hodges." The housekeeper led them through the entrance hall, and Evangeline had to bite her tongue to keep from crying out. The paintings were gone, her grandfather's portrait, her mother's landscape collection, all vanished, leaving pale rectangles on the wallpaper like ghosts. The Chinese vase that had stood on the hall table for generations had been replaced with something cheap and garish. Even the runner beneath their feet was worn nearly through, unraveling at the edges. "What happened to the paintings?" Evangeline asked, though she already knew the answer. Mrs. Hodges wouldn't meet her eyes. "Sold, miss." Lady Gertrude said they were needed to pay debts. "So many things have been sold these past months. The silver service, the library books, even some of the furniture from the unused rooms. To pay debts that never existed," Evangeline thought bitterly. "To line her aunt's pockets while she forced me to sleep in the servants' quarters and scrub the floors of my own home." The morning room was a study in contrasts. Lady Gertrude sat in splendor amidst the decay, wearing a gown of expensive silk that must have cost more than the servants' wages for a month. Her daughter Beatrice lounged beside her, picking at sugared almonds from a silver dish, one of the few pieces of valuable plate that remained. Both women looked up as Mrs. Hodges announced them, and Evangeline had the satisfaction of watching all color drain from her aunt's face. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Lady Gertrude rose, her voice shrill. "You have no right to appear here unannounced, Evangeline. This is still my home, your home." Julian's voice cut through her protests like a razor. "How fascinating. I was under the impression that Hastings Manor belonged to the Hastings estate, held in trust for Miss Evangeline Hastings until her majority or marriage. Which, as you may recall, has now occurred." Lady Gertrude's hands clenched at her sides. "The marriage hasn't been formalized. No banns have been read, no settlement agreed upon. For all I know, this is some elaborate deception. The special license was procured yesterday," Julian said mildly, producing a document from his coat. "We'll be married by week's end at St. George's. The settlement, however, has already been agreed upon. Miss Hastings will retain full control of her inheritance, to be managed jointly with her husband until such time as all irregularities in the estate accounts have been resolved." Beatrice gasped. "Mamma, what does he mean, irregularities?" "He means nothing," Lady Gertrude snapped, but her eyes darted to the door as though calculating her escape. "Evangeline's inheritance is a pittance, barely enough to maintain this house. The debts were fabricated." Evangeline found her voice at last, stepping forward into the room where she had once taken breakfast with her parents. The wallpaper was peeling near the windows. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling. Her mother would have wept to see it. "My father left me £40,000, Aunt Gertrude. Where has it gone?" The silence that followed was damning. Beatrice looked at her mother with dawning horror. Lady Gertrude's mask of righteous indignation cracked, revealing the calculation beneath. "You ungrateful wretch," she hissed. "I took you in when you had nothing. Fed you, clothed you. You dressed me in rags and worked me like a scullery maid while you sold my inheritance piece by piece." Evangeline's voice shook, but she held her ground. "You destroyed my mother's portraits. You let my father's library mold in the damp. You've run this house into ruin while wearing gowns that cost more than the servants' yearly wages. She moved to the window, looking out at the gardens that had once been her mother's pride. The rose arbor where her parents had been married was collapsing, strangled by weeds. The reflecting pool was choked with algae. Even the old oak where her father had hung a swing had been cut down, probably sold for timber. "I want a full accounting," Evangeline said, turning back to her aunt. "Every sale, every transaction, every penny spent from the estate funds. You have 1 week to produce the ledgers. And if I refuse?" Lady Gertrude's voice dripped venom. Julian stepped forward, his presence suddenly menacing despite his stillness. "Then I will have the magistrate and my solicitors here by morning. We'll go through this house room by room, document by document, until we've built a case for the Old Bailey. Embezzlement of a ward's inheritance is a hanging offence, Lady Gertrude. At the very least, it's transportation to the colonies." Beatrice whimpered. Lady Gertrude swayed, gripping the back of her chair for support. "1 week," Julian repeated. "You may remain in this house until then, as a courtesy to the family name. After that, Miss Hastings, my wife, will take possession of her rightful property. I suggest you use the time to secure alternative lodgings." They left Lady Gertrude standing amid her plundered spoils, her face ashen with the realization that her carefully constructed empire of theft was crumbling around her. In the carriage, Evangeline finally allowed herself to weep, not for what she had lost, but for what her aunt had so callously destroyed. Julian said nothing, merely offered his handkerchief and looked away to give her privacy in her grief. Only when they were well away from the manor did he speak. "You were magnificent." "I was terrified." "Yes," he agreed. "But you didn't let her see it. That, Miss Hastings, is the difference between surviving and conquering." The wedding had been a quiet affair at St. George's, witnessed by Julian's solicitor and a handful of servants who looked at Evangeline with a mixture of curiosity and pity. She had worn the sapphire gown from the night of the ball, her hand trembling only slightly as Julian slipped a ring of gold and diamonds onto her finger. The vows felt surreal, spoken in a church empty of family or friends, binding her to a man who had promised her freedom even as he gave her his name. Now, a week into her marriage, Evangeline stood in the music room of Sunningdale House while Madame Messier circled her like a hawk evaluating prey. Again, the Frenchwoman commanded, her accent sharp as a blade. "A countess does not slouch. Your spine should be steel, your chin level. You are not begging for scraps, you are claiming what is yours by right." Evangeline straightened, fighting the instinct to make herself small that 3 years of servitude had beaten into her bones. Across the room, Julian sat in a wing-back chair, ostensibly reading correspondence but watching the proceedings with those dark, assessing eyes that missed nothing. "Better," Madame Messier conceded. "Now, walk to the window and back. Remember, you are not a servant scurrying to complete a task. You are a woman of consequence moving through a space that belongs to you. It should have been easy." Evangeline had been taught to walk properly as a child, had learned deportment and grace from her own mother. But Lady Gertrude had spent 3 years training those instincts out of her, teaching her to keep her eyes down, her steps quick and silent, her presence as unobtrusive as possible. She made it 3 steps before her shoulders began to curve inward. "No." Madame Messier's walking stick rapped against the floor. "You apologize with your body, girl. Every movement says, 'Forgive me for existing.' Is that what you wish to convey to the society that will watch your every move?" "I'm trying," Evangeline said, hating the defensive note in her voice. "You are trying to disappear," Julian said quietly from his chair. He set aside his papers and rose, crossing to where she stood frozen in the middle of the room. "Madam, if you would give us a moment." The Frenchwoman sniffed but withdrew to the far end of the room, making a show of examining the sheet music on the pianoforte. Julian stopped before Evangeline, his expression unreadable. "Why do you think I hired Madame Messier?" "To teach me how to be a countess," Evangeline said. To refine me so I don't embarrass you when we appear in society. No. His voice held a note of frustration. I hired her because you've spent 3 years being told you're worthless, and I thought a strict instructor might help you remember what you were before your aunt tried to break you. But I'm beginning to think I made a mistake. The words stung more than they should have. Evangeline lifted her chin, a spark of the old defiance flaring in her chest. Then dismiss her. Send me back to my rooms. I told you this was pointless. It's pointless because you already know how to carry yourself like a countess, Evangeline. Julian's use of her given name startled her. He had been scrupulously formal since their marriage, maintaining the careful distance of their arrangement. I've watched you these past days. When you forget to be afraid, when you're angry or determined, you move like you were born to command a room. The problem isn't your training. It's your belief that you deserve to take up space in the world. I don't know how to believe that anymore, she whispered. Then let me show you something. He offered his arm. Madam, we'll continue tomorrow. Please have cook send tea to the portrait gallery. The portrait gallery ran the length of Sunningdale House's second floor, a cathedral of family history lined with paintings of Sunningdale ancestors dating back 2 centuries. Julian led her past stern-faced earls and elegant countesses, pausing before a portrait near the end of the hall. The woman in the painting was perhaps 40, dressed in the fashion of 30 years prior, her dark hair shot through with silver. But it was her eyes that arrested Evangeline, intelligent, fierce, utterly unbowed. My mother, Julian said. The 6th Countess of Sunningdale. She was the daughter of a country vicar with no fortune and no connections. The match was considered ruinous. My father's family threatened to disown him. Evangeline studied the portrait, seeing echoes of Julian in the set of the woman's jaw, the directness of her gaze. What happened? She became the most formidable hostess in London. Within 5 years, invitations to her salons were more coveted than vouchers to Almack's. She had a mind for politics and business that put most men to shame. My father consulted her on every major decision regarding the estate. Julian's voice softened. She used to say that true authority doesn't come from birth or breeding. It comes from knowing your own worth and refusing to let anyone convince you otherwise. She sounds remarkable. She was. And she would have liked you enormously. He turned to face Evangeline fully. You think you need to learn how to be a countess, but you're wrong. You need to remember how to be Evangeline Hastings, the girl whose father trusted her enough to leave her a fortune, whose mother taught her grace and dignity, who survived 3 years of cruelty without losing the spark that made her sneak into a ball she was forbidden to attend. Evangeline felt something crack open in her chest, a fissure in the armor of shame and doubt she'd worn for so long. I don't know how to be her anymore. Yes, you do. Julian's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. I saw her the night of the ball, standing in that torn dress with her chin up, refusing to give your aunt the satisfaction of seeing her cower. I saw her at Hastings Manor, demanding an accounting while her voice shook with rage. That woman doesn't need Madame Messier to teach her how to walk. She needs permission to stop apologizing for existing. Tears pricked at Evangeline's eyes. You hardly know me. I know you're your father's daughter. I know you have a core of steel beneath the fear. And I know that when you stop trying to make yourself small, you're going to be absolutely terrifying to everyone who underestimated you. He gestured to the portrait. My mother kept a journal. I found it after she died. In it, she wrote that the Ton would try to make her feel inferior every day of her life, and that her victory lay in refusing to believe them. I think you could benefit from reading it. Why are you doing this? Evangeline asked. The marriage, yes, I understand the practical reasons. But this? Trying to rebuild my confidence? You gain nothing from it. Julian was quiet for a long moment, his eyes still on his mother's portrait. I made a promise to your father. But more than that, I've spent my entire life watching the strong prey on the weak, the title destroy those beneath them simply because they can. Your aunt is everything I despise about our class, the cruelty dressed up as charity, the theft disguised as guardianship. Watching you reclaim yourself, seeing you take back everything she tried to steal from you. He met her eyes. That's not nothing, Evangeline. That's justice. And it's long overdue. She looked up at the portrait of the vicar's daughter who became a countess, at the fierce intelligence in painted eyes, and felt something shift inside her, not a transformation, but a remembering. No more Madame Messier, she said. No more Madame Messier, Julian agreed. But I want to read your mother's journals. And I want you to teach me everything you know about society, about the people who will judge me, about how to move through their world without fear. For the first time since their wedding, Julian smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually austere features. That, Countess, would be my genuine pleasure. The clock in the entrance hall of Hastings Manor struck midnight as Evangeline eased open the library window from the outside, her heart hammering against her ribs. The irony was not lost on her, breaking into her own home like a thief in the night, searching for evidence of theft committed against her. Steady, Julian whispered from below, his hands braced at her waist as she balanced on his shoulders. Can you reach the latch? Almost. Her fingers scrabbled against the window frame, finding purchase on the old mechanism. With a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet night, the latch gave way. She pushed the window open and hauled herself through with more determination than grace, landing in an undignified heap on the library floor. Julian followed with considerably more elegance, dropping silently beside her and closing the window behind them. They stood in the darkness of what had once been her father's sanctuary, the smell of old leather and pipe tobacco still lingering despite 3 years of neglect. She'll have hidden them somewhere in here, Evangeline breathed, pulling the dark lantern from her cloak and opening its shutter just enough to cast a thin beam of light. Father kept all the estate ledgers in the library. Aunt Gertrude wouldn't have dared move them elsewhere, too risky if the solicitors asked to inspect them. Then she's altered them. Julian moved to the massive desk that dominated the room, running his fingers along the drawers. The question is whether she was clever enough to destroy the originals or arrogant enough to keep them. They had been planning this for days, ever since Lady Gertrude had responded to their demand for an accounting with a set of immaculately falsified ledgers showing modest estate income and perfectly reasonable expenditures. On paper, she appeared the model guardian, carefully stewarding a dwindling inheritance through difficult times. But Julian's investigators had found the truth in bank records and property sales, in witnesses who remembered transactions that never appeared in the official accounts. What they needed now was proof in Lady Gertrude's own hand, the real ledgers that would show the systematic looting of the Hastings fortune. Evangeline moved to the bookshelves, running her light along familiar spines. How many hours had she spent here as a child, reading while her father worked at his desk? The memory was so vivid she could almost hear his voice asking her opinion on some passage of poetry, see his smile when she gave an answer that pleased him. Focus, she told herself, pushing sentiment aside. Her father had trusted her to be strong. She would not fail him now. The official ledgers sat in plain view on the desk, their leather covers embossed with the Hastings crest. Too obvious. Too accessible. Lady Gertrude would have hidden the real account somewhere less conspicuous, somewhere she could access them regularly without arousing suspicion. The locked cabinet, Evangeline said suddenly, crossing to a mahogany cabinet built into the wall beside the fireplace. Father kept his personal correspondence there. He was the only one with a key. Julian joined her, examining the lock by lamplight. Do you know where he kept it? He wore it on his watch chain. I imagine Aunt Gertrude claimed it after his death. Evangeline pulled 2 hairpins from her coiffure, the same pin she'd once used to unlock the kitchen pantry when her aunt had locked her in without supper. Some skills, it seemed, transcended station. "You're full of surprises, Countess," Julian murmured, watching as she worked the pins into the mechanism. "I had considerable time to develop unusual talents while scrubbing floors." The lock resisted, then gave with a soft snick. Evangeline pulled the cabinet doors open, revealing stacks of papers and leather-bound volumes crammed haphazardly inside. They were not her father's neat files. These were chaotic, stuffed with loose papers and marked with Lady Gertrude's aggressive handwriting. Evangeline pulled out the first ledger, opening it to reveal columns of numbers that made her stomach turn. Hastings Manor sold to Lord Pemberton for £2,000. Market value, £8,000. Difference deposited to G. Hastings' personal account. Durham Coal shares, 500 units sold at £3 per share. Market value at time of sale, £7 per share. Difference deposited to G. Hastings' personal account. Page after page of theft, meticulously recorded in her aunt's own hand. The woman had been so confident of her control over Evangeline, so certain that her niece would never challenge her authority, that she had documented every fraudulent transaction. She kept records of everything. Evangeline breathed, horror and triumph warring in her voice. Every sale, every false valuation, every penny she stole. Julian leaned over her shoulder, his breath warm against her ear as he scanned the entries. "This is more than we hoped for. This is a complete confession." He reached past her to pull out another volume, then another. "There must be 10 years of accounts here. Not just your inheritance, she's been embezzling from the estate since before your father died." A floorboard creaked overhead. They both froze. Evangeline's hand tightened on the ledger as Julian doused the lantern, plunging them into darkness. Above them, footsteps moved across the bedroom that had once been Evangeline's nursery, now occupied by her cousin Beatrice. "She's just restless," Evangeline whispered, barely breathing the words. "She'll go back to sleep." But the footsteps didn't stop. They moved to the hallway, then to the stairs. A door opened somewhere in the house, and Evangeline heard her aunt's voice, sharp with suspicion. "Beatrice? Why are you awake at this hour?" "I thought I heard something, Mamma." "From the library." Julian's hand found Evangeline's in the darkness, squeezing once in warning or reassurance. They had perhaps 30 seconds before Lady Gertrude came to investigate. The window was too far, too noisy. The library had only one door, and it opened to the main hallway where the women's voices were growing louder. "The desk," Julian breathed against her ear. "Can you fit beneath it?" "Not both of us." "I'll use the window." "If she finds you, you have every right to be here. It's your house. Claim you couldn't sleep and came for a book." With the cabinet open and ledgers everywhere. The footsteps were on the stairs now. Light bloomed in the crack beneath the door. Evangeline made a decision born of 3 years of hiding from her aunt's rages. She grabbed Julian's hand and pulled him toward the heavy curtains that flanked the library's bay window, the same curtain she'd hidden behind as a child during games of hide-and-seek with her father. The fabric was thick velvet, musty with disuse, falling in heavy folds that created a narrow space between curtain and window. They pressed themselves into the gap just as the library door opened. Through a gap in the velvet, Evangeline could see her aunt enter with a candelabra held high, Beatrice trailing behind in her nightdress. "I told you it was nothing," Lady Gertrude said, but her eye swept the room with predatory alertness. "Merely the house settling. These old manners creak like arthritic bones." Then her gaze fell on the open cabinet. The color drained from her face. She rushed forward, candlelight illuminating the scattered ledgers, the evidence of her crime spread across the desk where she had left them in her haste to respond to Beatrice's alarm. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no. I locked this. I know I locked it." "Mamma, what are those?" Beatrice peered at the ledgers, picking one up. These numbers, this is more money than you said the estate was worth. Lady Gertrude snatched the book from her daughter's hands, clutching it to her chest. Her eyes darted around the library, wild with panic. Someone's been here. Someone broke in. Who would break in just to open a cabinet? Beatrice asked, reasonable and confused. Her, Lady Gertrude spat. That ungrateful wretch and her calculating husband. They're trying to ruin me. She began gathering the ledgers frantically, stuffing them back into the cabinet. But her hands shook so badly that papers scattered across the floor, evidence of her guilt literally falling at her feet. Behind the curtain, Evangeline felt Julian's chest move with silent, grim satisfaction. They didn't need to steal the ledgers after all. They had witnessed Lady Gertrude's panic, her admission of guilt, a desperate attempt to hide evidence that she knew would destroy her. And tomorrow, Julian's solicitors would arrive with a warrant to search the premises, and Lady Gertrude would have no choice but to surrender every scrap of paper that proved her theft. Justice, Evangeline thought, watching her aunt scramble to contain her crumbling empire, was sometimes simply giving a thief enough rope to hang herself. The scandal broke over London society like a summer storm, sudden and devastating. Evangeline first learned of it at Lady Pemberton's afternoon salon, where the whispers followed her like wasps circling honey. She had been speaking with Mrs. Ashworth about a charity for impoverished governesses when she noticed the woman's eyes darting nervously over Evangeline's shoulder. The conversation around them had developed a peculiar quality, too loud, too bright, designed to mask the undercurrent of gossip flowing just beneath the surface pleasantries. "Excuse me," Mrs. Ashworth said abruptly, her teacup rattling in its saucer. "I've just remembered an appointment." "How forgetful of me." She fled as though the upholstery had caught fire, leaving Evangeline standing alone in the middle of the drawing room. The whispers grew louder, no longer bothering with subtlety. Can't possibly be true. Her own aunt making such claims. Poor Earl, trapped in a marriage to a nobody. Lady Charlotte Vane materialized at Evangeline's elbow with the predatory grace of a cat who'd cornered a mouse. "My dear Countess, how brave of you to appear today. I confess, I'm not certain I could show my face in society if such dreadful rumors were circulating about my parentage." The words hit like a physical blow. "I beg your pardon." "Oh, you haven't heard." Lady Charlotte's eyes glittered with malicious delight. "I suppose it's best you learn from a friend rather than overhearing it whispered behind your back. Your aunt, Lady Gertrude, is it, has been telling the most extraordinary story. She claims your mother had an affair with one of the grooms, and that your dear departed father wasn't actually your father at all. Can you imagine? Such wickedness, if true. And if it is true, well." She smiled, showing too many teeth. "I suppose that makes your marriage rather irregular, doesn't it? One can hardly inherit an estate or a title through a bastard line." The room tilted. Evangeline gripped the back of a nearby chair, her knuckles white against the gilt frame. Around her, the salon had gone silent, every ear straining to hear her response. "That is a vile lie," she said, proud that her voice emerged steady despite the rage and horror churning in her stomach. "Of course it is, darling," Lady Charlotte purred. "But you know how these things are. Mud sticks, even when thrown by liars. Especially when the liar is one's own family. Why would a devoted aunt spread such terrible falsehoods about her own niece unless there was some truth to them? Because she's desperate, Evangeline thought. Because Julian's solicitors are scheduled to present their evidence to the magistrate in 3 days, and she needs a way to discredit me before her theft is exposed. If you'll excuse me," Evangeline said, setting down her untouched tea with careful precision. "I find I'm not feeling well." She walked toward the door with her spine straight and her chin level, just as Julian had taught her. "Don't run. Don't let them see you break." Every eye in the room followed her exit, measuring her reaction, cataloguing evidence for future gossip. The carriage ride back to Sunningdale House passed in a blur of fury and fear. By the time she arrived, Julian was already waiting in the entrance hall, his face carved from granite, a newspaper crumpled in his fist. "You've seen it," she said. "Not a question." The Times published a retraction within an hour of printing Lady Gertrude's claims, but the damage is done. Half of London has read it by now. He handed her the paper, where a small notice buried on page 7 repeated the vicious lie in black and white. Lady G. Hastings, of Hastings Manor, Warwickshire, wishes it to be known that her late brother's wife, Mrs. Catherine Hastings, engaged in improper relations with household staff during her marriage. Questions have arisen regarding the legitimacy of the child born from said union, currently claiming to be Miss Evangeline Hastings. Lady G. Hastings feels it her Christian duty to expose this deception before further damage to the noble Hastings' name can occur. "My mother was the most virtuous woman who ever lived," Evangeline said, her voice shaking with rage. "She loved my father beyond measure. To suggest she would, that I am," the words choked in her throat. "I know." Julian's hand found her shoulder, steady and grounding. "Everyone who knew your mother knows this is a fabrication." But Lady Gertrude isn't trying to convince people who knew Catherine Hastings. She's trying to plant doubt in the minds of magistrates and solicitors who never met her. Can she do that? Can she actually invalidate my claim to the estate based on lies? She can try. Julian led her into his study, where documents already lay spread across his desk. He'd been working on this for hours. If she can prove illegitimacy, or even cast sufficient doubt upon your parentage, the inheritance would revert to the next legitimate heir, which, conveniently, is her daughter Beatrice. There must be something we can do. Birth records, baptismal certificates, all of which prove you are Catherine and Robert Hastings' daughter, but none of which definitively prove Robert was your father. Julian's jaw tightened. That's the insidious brilliance of this particular lie. It's nearly impossible to disprove without Robert Hastings himself rising from the grave to swear to your legitimacy. Evangeline sank into a chair, her hands trembling in her lap. 3 years of cruelty she had endured. 3 years of being treated as less than human while her aunt stole her inheritance. And now, on the verge of justice, Lady Gertrude had found a weapon that could destroy everything. "What about the marriage?" she asked quietly. Lady Charlotte was gleeful in pointing out that a bastard cannot convey legitimacy through marriage to an earl's title. "The marriage stands regardless of your legitimacy," Julian said firmly. "You are my wife, Evangeline. That doesn't change. But your claim to the Hastings estate, your ability to prosecute your aunt for embezzlement, that becomes significantly more complicated if she succeeds in casting doubt on your parentage. She's going to win." The words tasted like ash. "After everything, she's going to steal my inheritance and walk away unpunished." "No." Julian crossed to where she sat, crouching before her so their eyes were level. "She's going to fail because she's made a critical error. She's so desperate to escape prosecution that she's destroyed her own credibility." "How?" "Everyone believes her. Everyone believes the scandal, but that's different from believing the woman. Lady Gertrude has just publicly accused her own sister-in-law of adultery and her niece of bastardy. She's violated every rule of familial loyalty and feminine propriety society holds sacred." Julian's eyes burned with cold fury. A woman who would spread such vicious lies about her own blood is a woman capable of any deception, including, say, embezzling her ward's inheritance. Understanding dawned slowly. "You're going to use her own cruelty against her." "I'm going to let her cruelty speak for itself. Tomorrow, we'll visit every family that knew your parents. We'll show them the love letters Robert wrote to Catherine, the journal entries where he spoke of his joy at your birth, the will where he named you his beloved daughter without qualification or doubt. and we'll let them draw their own conclusions about whether your father believed you were his child. And if they still doubt, then we'll present the evidence of Lady Gertrude's theft so overwhelming that no magistrate will care about questions of parentage. She's stolen £40,000, Evangeline. That crime stands regardless of who your father was. A knock interrupted them. Julian's butler entered with a silver salver bearing a single calling card. The Dowager Duchess of Somerset to see Lady Sunningdale, he announced. Julian and Evangeline exchanged glances of surprise. The Dowager Duchess was society's reigning matriarch, a woman whose good opinion could make or break a reputation. "Show her in," Julian said. The Duchess entered in a rustle of black silk, her cane tapping against the floor with imperial authority. She was perhaps 70, with snow-white hair and eyes sharp as cut diamonds. "I'll be brief," she announced without preamble. "I knew your mother, child. Catherine Hastings was my goddaughter, and I attended your christening where your father wept with joy to hold you. Lady Gertrude's claims are the desperate lies of a thief facing justice." She fixed Evangeline with a penetrating stare. "Tomorrow at 3, you will attend my salon. You will hold your head high while I tell all of London that anyone who questions your legitimacy will answer to me. Do you understand?" Evangeline rose, curtsying with trembling grace. "Your Grace, I cannot thank you enough." "Don't thank me. Prove me right." The Duchess turned to leave, then paused. "Your mother once told me that the Hastings women were forged from steel, not porcelain. Don't make a liar of her, girl." When she was gone, Evangeline looked at Julian with something that might have been hope. "We fight," she said. "We fight," he agreed. "And we win." The law offices of Blackwood, Sterling and Associates occupied a sombre building in Lincoln's Inn Fields, where generations of solicitors had settled matters of inheritance, scandal, and familial destruction with equal bureaucratic efficiency. Evangeline sat in the mahogany-panelled conference room with her hands folded in her lap, willing them not to shake as Lady Gertrude's solicitor, a weasel-faced man named Mr. Grimsby, laid out his client's case. "The matter is quite simple," Grimsby said, arranging papers before him with fussy precision. "Lady Gertrude Hastings, as guardian to the purported Miss Evangeline Hastings, has become aware of certain irregularities regarding the young woman's parentage. In good conscience, she cannot allow a fraud to inherit the Hastings estate." "A fraud?" Evangeline's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Choose your words carefully, Mr. Grimsby. You're speaking of the daughter of Robert and Catherine Hastings, not some impostor plucked from the streets." Across the table, Lady Gertrude sat with her hands clasped before her, the picture of sorrowful duty. She had dressed in mourning colours, playing the role of grieving sister-in-law forced to expose a painful truth. Beatrice sat beside her mother, eyes downcast, clearly uncomfortable with the proceedings. "Lady Gertrude, Mr. Blackwood said, the senior partner's voice heavy with distaste for the entire affair, "You are making extraordinary claims that strike at the heart of a woman's honour, both your late sister-in-law's and your niece's. I trust you have evidence beyond mere speculation." Lady Gertrude dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "It pains me beyond measure to speak of it, but I have a duty to the truth. My dear brother Robert confided in me during the final weeks of his life. He harboured doubts about the child's parentage, doubts that had haunted him for years." "That's a lie," Evangeline said flatly. "My father never doubted me. He loved me." "He pitied you," Lady Gertrude shot back, her mask of sorrow slipping for just a moment. "He couldn't bear to shame Catherine by exposing her indiscretion, so he claimed you as his own. But I saw the truth in his eyes, the pain of raising another man's bastard." Julian's hand found Evangeline's beneath the table, squeezing once in warning. "Don't let her bait you. Stay calm." Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat. "Did Mr. Robert Hastings put these alleged doubts in writing? Make any formal declaration questioning the child's legitimacy?" He was too much of a gentleman, Lady Gertrude said. But there are other proofs. The child bears no resemblance to the Hastings family. Her colouring, her features, all wrong. I have my mother's features, Evangeline said, as anyone with eyes can see from the portraits at Hastings Manor. Or rather, the portraits that used to hang there before you sold them. Grimsby shuffled his papers nervously. Lady Gertrude also has testimony from several former servants who recall irregularities in Mrs. Hastings' behaviour during the relevant time period. Servants you've paid or threatened, Julian interjected, his voice cold as winter steel. We have counter-testimony from the household staff who actually served the family during that time, all of whom attest to Mrs. Catherine Hastings' impeccable character and the clear resemblance between Robert Hastings and his daughter. Servants can be bought on both sides, Grimsby said with an oily smile. The question before us is one of proof. Can Miss Hastings, or should I say, the woman claiming to be Miss Hastings, provide definitive evidence of her legitimacy? The room fell silent. This was the crux of it, the impossible burden of proof. How did one prove a negative? How did one demonstrate beyond doubt that an affair had not occurred, that whispered accusations were lies? Evangeline felt the weight of their expectation, the trap closing around her. Lady Gertrude smiled faintly, sensing victory. Then Beatrice spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mamma, this is wrong." Lady Gertrude's head snapped toward her daughter. "Be silent." "No." Beatrice's hands trembled as she placed a leather-bound volume on the table. "I won't be silent anymore. I won't let you do this." "Beatrice," Lady Gertrude hissed, her face draining of colour. "What are you doing?" "The right thing." "Finally." Beatrice pushed the volume toward Mr. Blackwood. "This is Uncle Robert's private journal from the year of Evangeline's birth. I found it in Mamma's dressing room hidden among her things. She kept it as insurance, I think, in case anyone ever questioned her guardianship. But it proves everything she's saying now is a lie." Lady Gertrude lunged across the table, trying to snatch the journal, but Julian was faster. He caught her wrist, holding her back while Mr. Blackwood opened the volume with the careful reverence due to evidence that could destroy or save a life. August 15th. Blackwood read aloud. "Today my daughter was born, and I have never known such perfect joy. She has her mother's eyes and my stubborn chin. Catherine says she is a miracle, and I cannot disagree. I shall teach her to ride and read Latin and manage an estate, for she will be the finest of the Hastings line." Evangeline pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Her father's words, his joy, preserved in ink and bound in leather. Proof not of blood or biology, but of something more fundamental, the love of a man for his child. Blackwood continued reading, page after page of entries documenting Evangeline's childhood, her father's pride in her accomplishments, his plans for her future. Never once did Robert Hastings express doubt or distance. Every word radiated paternal devotion. "There's more," Beatrice said quietly, her own face wet with tears. "Mamma's real ledgers are in there too. She kept them tucked inside the journal. Every fraudulent transaction, every stolen pound. I couldn't let her destroy Evangeline's life to hide her crimes." Lady Gertrude sagged in her chair, the fight draining out of her. "You stupid girl," she whispered to her daughter. "You've ruined us both." "No, Mamma. You ruined us when you chose greed over honor." Beatrice turned to Evangeline. "I'm sorry. I should have stopped her years ago. I knew what she was doing to you, and I did nothing. I was a coward." "You're here now," Evangeline said softly. "That takes more courage than you know." Mr. Blackwood closed the journal with a definitive thud. "I believe we have all the evidence we need, gentlemen." Lady Gertrude, your claims of illegitimacy are not only unfounded but appear to be part of a calculated attempt to avoid prosecution for embezzlement. Mr. Grimsby, I suggest you advise your client to withdraw her accusations immediately and cooperate fully with the investigation into the missing estate funds. Grimsby had gone pale, clearly realizing he'd hitched his wagon to a sinking ship. Lady Gertrude, perhaps we should discuss. It's over, Lady Gertrude said flatly. All pretense had dropped away, leaving only bitter defeat. She's won. The ungrateful wretch has won. Not ungrateful, Evangeline said, rising from her seat with the grace of a queen pronouncing judgment. Simply unwilling to be destroyed by you any longer. You stole my inheritance, my home, 3 years of my life. You worked me like a servant in my own house, told me I was worthless, made me believe I deserved nothing. And when that wasn't enough, you tried to destroy my mother's memory and my father's love. She leaned across the table, holding her aunt's gaze without flinching. But you failed. Because my parents raised me to be strong, even when I forgot it. And because you underestimated the power of truth. What happens now? Beatrice asked, her voice small. Julian stood beside Evangeline, his presence solid and reassuring. Now the magistrate reviews the evidence of embezzlement. Lady Gertrude will be charged, tried, and likely convicted. The estate will be restored to its rightful owner. And Evangeline will decide what mercy, if any, to show to the woman who showed her none. Lady Gertrude laughed, a broken sound without humor. Mercy? From her? I'd sooner expect it from the hangman. Evangeline looked at the woman who had tormented her, seeing not a monster but a pitiable creature consumed by greed and bitterness. You'll be prosecuted for your crimes. The law will have its due. But I won't seek the harshest penalties. For my father's sake, because you were his sister by marriage. And for Beatrice's sake, because she deserves better than to watch her mother hang. Transportation then, Lady Gertrude said dully. The colonies. A slow death instead of a quick one. House arrest on a small property in Yorkshire, Evangeline said. Supervised by trustees. A pension sufficient for basic needs, nothing more. You'll live out your days in obscurity, which I suspect you'll find worse than any prison. It was more than Lady Gertrude deserved, and they all knew it. But Evangeline had learned that true strength lay not in crushing one's enemies, but in rising above the desire for vengeance. The meeting concluded with the scratch of pens on documents, the formal acknowledgement of Evangeline's legitimacy and rightful inheritance. As they left the offices, Julian offered his arm and Evangeline took it, feeling the weight of 3 years of suffering finally beginning to lift. You were merciful, he observed. I was free, she corrected. Mercy was simply the byproduct. The Midsummer Gala at Somerset House was the pinnacle of the London season, an event where the cream of society gathered to see and be seen under 1,000 glittering candles. Evangeline stood before the mirror in her dressing room at Sunningdale House, barely recognizing the woman who stared back at her. The gown was a masterpiece of ivory silk and champagne lace, cut in the latest fashion with a bodice that emphasized her figure without sacrificing elegance. But it was the jewels that transformed her from merely beautiful to absolutely devastating. The Hastings emeralds, recovered from the pawnbroker where Lady Gertrude had sold them for a fraction of their worth, blazed at her throat and ears, each stone the size of a robin's egg and clear as spring water. You look like a queen, Martha said softly, securing the final pin in Evangeline's elaborate coiffure. I feel like an imposter, Evangeline admitted, her fingers trembling as they touched the emerald necklace. The last time I attended a ball, I was thrown out like refuse. What if they remember? Julian's voice came from the doorway. He entered, magnificent in black evening clothes that emphasized his commanding presence, and met her eyes in the mirror. Let them remember. Let them recall the girl they pitied and dismissed. It will make your triumph all the sweeter. He crossed to stand behind her, and for a moment they were reflected together, the Earl and his Countess, a portrait of aristocratic power. But Evangeline could still see the shadow of the girl she'd been, cowering in servants' corridors, believing herself worthless. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. Julian's hands came to rest on her shoulders, warm and grounding. "You've already done harder things. You survived 3 years of cruelty. You reclaimed your inheritance. You faced down your aunt in a room full of lawyers and proved your legitimacy. Walking into a ballroom is nothing compared to that. Walking into the ballroom where I was humiliated before all of London," she corrected. "Walking into a ballroom as the Countess of Sunningdale, with the Hastings fortune restored and your enemies defeated." His eyes held hers in the mirror. "You're not the same woman who was cast out of that ball, Evangeline. You've become who you were always meant to be." She drew a deep breath, feeling the steel in her spine that had been forged through suffering and tempered by justice. "Then let's remind them who the Hastings family is." The carriage ride to Somerset House seemed both endless and far too brief. Evangeline's hands clenched and unclenched in her lap until Julian covered them with his own. "Breathe," he said simply. "And remember, you owe them nothing. Not your fear, not your shame, nothing. They are privileged to witness your return." The carriage door opened, and suddenly they were there, standing at the base of the grand staircase as their names were announced to the assembled throng. The Earl and Countess of Sunningdale. The ballroom fell silent as every head turned toward them. Evangeline felt the weight of hundreds of eyes, saw the shock register on face after face as society recognized the girl they'd watched being cast out in rags now descending the stairs in a fortune of emeralds. She kept her chin level, her posture perfect, one gloved hand resting lightly on Julian's arm as they moved through the crowd that parted before them like the Red Sea before Moses. The whispers followed in their wake, but they were different now, tinged with awe and speculation rather than pity and scorn. Lady Pemberton stood frozen with her fan forgotten in her hands. Lord Hertford bowed so deeply it bordered on obsequious. And there, near the refreshment table, Lady Charlotte Vane stared with an expression of such acute jealousy that Evangeline almost pitied her. Almost. The Dowager Duchess of Somerset materialized before them, resplendent in purple silk and diamonds. "Countess Sunningdale," she said warmly, offering her hands. "How magnificent you look! Those emeralds were your grandmother's, were they not? I remember when she wore them to the coronation. They suit you even better." "Your Grace is too kind," Evangeline said, curtsying with the grace her mother had taught her a lifetime ago. "Not kind. Honest. There's a difference." The Duchess's voice carried deliberately, ensuring everyone nearby could hear. "I knew your mother from the cradle, child. You have her beauty and your father's courage. The Hastings line has produced many fine women, but I believe you may be the finest of them all." The endorsement was deliberate and devastating. With those few words, the Duchess had sealed Evangeline's acceptance into the highest echelons of society. Anyone who questioned her legitimacy or her right to be here would now be questioning the Duchess's judgment. "Thank you," Evangeline said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've been a guardian angel when I needed one most." "Nonsense. I merely reminded people of what they should have remembered all along." The Duchess tapped her cane for emphasis. "Now go. Dance with your husband. Show them that the girl they dismissed has become a woman they cannot ignore." The orchestra struck up a waltz, and Julian led Evangeline to the center of the floor. As his hand settled at her waist and hers came to rest on his shoulder, she was transported back to another ballroom, another waltz that had never happened. The dance her father had promised to teach her for the debut she'd been denied. "I've got you," Julian murmured as they began to move. "Don't think about them. Just follow my lead." But Evangeline didn't need to follow. The steps came naturally, muscle memory from lessons long ago combining with the confidence she'd rebuilt from ashes. They moved across the floor in perfect synchronization, and gradually other couples joined them. The Duchess partnered with an elderly Duke, Lady Pemberton with her husband, even Lady Charlotte Vane swept into the dance by some ambitious young baron. As they turned, Evangeline caught sight of Beatrice standing at the edge of the ballroom. Her cousin wore a simple gown of dove grey, half mourning for her mother's disgrace, and watched the dancers with wistful longing. On impulse, Evangeline guided Julian toward the edge of the floor. "Invite Beatrice to dance," she said quietly. "Please." Julian followed her gaze, understanding dawning. "You're certain? She saved me when she could have stayed silent. She deserves better than to be punished for her mother's sins." When the waltz ended, Julian bowed to Evangeline, then crossed to where Beatrice stood. The girl's eyes widened in shock as the Earl of Sunningdale requested her hand for the next dance. Around them, whispers erupted, the cut direct everyone had expected transformed into an olive branch that would reshape Beatrice's entire social future. Lord Ashford appeared at Evangeline's side, offering his arm for the next set. Then Lord Hertford. Then a succession of gentlemen who had ignored her existence mere months ago, now falling over themselves for the honor of dancing with the Countess of Sunningdale. She accepted their attentions with gracious civility, neither punishing them for their previous coldness nor pretending it hadn't occurred. She was simply, magnificently, herself, a woman who had survived hell and emerged tempered like fine steel. As midnight approached, Evangeline found herself standing once more at the edge of the ballroom, a glass of champagne in her hand, watching the dancers swirl past. Julian joined her, and they stood in companionable silence, two people who had entered a marriage of convenience and found something far more complex. "Do you remember," she said softly, "the night of the Sunningdale ball? When you found me in that torn dress, humiliated before all of London?" "I remember thinking you were the bravest person I'd ever seen," Julian said. "Standing there with your world crumbling around you, still refusing to cower. I wanted to disappear. To cease existing. But you didn't. You fought. And you won." Evangeline turned to face him fully, seeing in his dark eye something that made her heart skip. Respect, certainly. Admiration. But also something warmer, something that had grown in the months of their partnership, their midnight heists and legal battles, their quiet conversations over breakfast, the thousand small intimacies of a shared life. "We won," she corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you." "You could have," Julian said. "But I'm profoundly grateful you didn't have to." The clock struck 12, and Evangeline raised her glass in a silent toast, to her parents, who had loved her. To her younger self, who had survived, to the woman she had become. The girl in tattered cloth had returned to the ballroom as a countess. But more than that, she had returned as herself, whole, unbroken, triumphant. And she had never bowed to anyone. The morning after the Midsummer Gala, Evangeline woke to sunlight streaming through the windows of her private chambers at Sunningdale House. For a moment, she lay still, letting the warmth wash over her, marveling at the simple luxury of waking without fear. No aunt to scream demands. No floors to scrub before dawn. No shame pressing down on her chest like a physical weight. She was free. The thought should have filled her with uncomplicated joy, but instead she found herself staring at the connecting door to Julian's chambers, a door that had never opened in all the months of their marriage. A marriage of convenience, he had promised. Protection and partnership, nothing more. She would have her own life, her own rooms, and when the battle was won, an annulment if she wished. The battle was won. Lady Gertrude had been dispatched to Yorkshire under guard 3 days ago, her sentence of house arrest beginning an exile from which she would never return. The Hastings fortune had been restored, every fraudulent transaction reversed, every stolen property reclaimed. Evangeline was wealthy beyond measure, socially triumphant, and legally free to dissolve the marriage that had saved her. So why did the thought of an annulment feel like losing something precious? A soft knock interrupted her reverie. Martha entered with morning chocolate and the post, her expression carefully neutral in that way servants adopted when they knew more about their employer's feelings than the employers knew themselves. "His lordship requests your presence in the breakfast room when you're ready, my lady. He says it's a matter of some importance." Evangeline's heart lurched. Of course. Julian would want to discuss the annulment now that their business was concluded. He had fulfilled his promise to her father, restored her to her rightful place. Their arrangement had reached its natural conclusion. She dressed with more care than a simple breakfast warranted, choosing a morning gown of pale blue muslin that Martha said brought out her eyes. Foolish vanity, she told herself. Yet she couldn't quite stop her hands from trembling as the maid arranged her hair. Julian was standing by the window when she entered the breakfast room, his back to her, tension evident in the set of his shoulders. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "You wanted to see me," she said, proud that her voice emerged steady. "Yes. I've been thinking about our arrangement." He gestured to the chair beside him rather than across the table, a subtle intimacy they'd developed over months of shared meals and strategizing. "Now that the legal matters are settled, we should discuss the future." "The annulment," Evangeline said, the word tasting like ashes. "Yes, of course. I understand." Julian's head snapped up, his dark eyes suddenly intense. "Do you want an annulment?" The question hung between them like a drawn sword. Evangeline's mind raced through a dozen careful, diplomatic responses. She could give him an easy exit, pretend the marriage had been merely transactional, release him from any obligation with grace and dignity. But she had spent 3 years making herself small, hiding her truth, pretending to be less than she was. She had promised herself never to do that again. "No," she said simply. "I don't want an annulment." The transformation in Julian's face was like watching sunrise break over a dark landscape. "Thank God," he breathed. "I've been rehearsing speeches for the past hour, trying to find a way to convince you to stay without pressuring you, without making you feel obligated when you owe me nothing." "Julian!" She crossed to where he stood, close enough to see the silver threading through his dark hair, the faint lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled. "Why would you need to convince me to stay?" He reached for her hand, his fingers warm and solid around hers. "Because this marriage began as a legal convenience. A contract designed to protect you and pursue justice. I gave you my word it would be in name only, that you would be free to seek an annulment when it was done. I can't simply change the terms now because somewhere along the way, He stopped, seeming to struggle with words that had never come easily to him. "Because you what?" Evangeline prompted, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Because I fell in love with my wife," Julian said quietly. With her courage and her fury, her refusal to be broken, the way she fought for justice not just for herself but for everyone your aunt had wronged. "I fell in love with the way you read in the library with your feet tucked under you. The way you argue legal precedent over breakfast. The way you've transformed from a frightened girl into a woman who makes the Dowager Duchess look tame by comparison." Evangeline felt tears prick her eyes. "I thought I was alone in this. I thought you were simply honoring your promise to my father." "I was. I am. But your father's dying wish was that you be protected and cherished. I've done the former. I'd very much like permission to attempt the latter." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, a gesture so tender it made her chest ache. "But only if that's what you want. If you'd prefer to annul the marriage and find someone you actually chose rather than someone circumstances forced upon you, I'll sign the papers without argument. Your happiness matters more than my feelings." "My happiness," Evangeline said slowly, "has been bound up with you for months now. You're the first person I want to tell when something amusing happens. The last person I think of before I sleep. You've seen me at my worst, broken and humiliated and consumed by rage, and you never once treated me as less than your equal. She stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. I didn't choose this marriage initially. You're right about that. But I choose it now. I choose you, Julian. Not because I'm grateful or obligated, but because somewhere between midnight heists and legal battles and learning to be myself again, I fell in love with my husband. The kiss was inevitable, gentle at first, tentative as they navigated this new territory. Then Julian's hand came up to cup her face and Evangeline's arms wound around his neck, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like a promise and a homecoming all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Julian rested his forehead against hers. I should have asked permission before. We're married, Evangeline reminded him, laughing. I think kissing falls within acceptable boundaries. A marriage in name only, I said. What an idiotic promise. An honorable one. Which is why I love you. She pulled back slightly to meet his eyes. But I think it's time we renegotiate the terms of our contract. What terms did you have in mind, Countess? A real marriage. Not convenient, not pretend. A partnership of equals who happen to be terribly in love with each other. She smiled, feeling joy bubble up inside her like champagne. Also, I think that connecting door between our chambers should actually be used for its intended purpose. Julian's laugh was warm and genuine, transforming his usually austere features into something approaching boyish delight. I believe those terms are acceptable. Should we seal the agreement with another kiss, or would you prefer to have the solicitors draw up formal documents? I've had quite enough of solicitors for a lifetime, Evangeline said, and pulled him down to her. Later, much later, they sat together in the library where Julian had first shown her the evidence of her aunt's crimes. Evangeline was tucked against his side on the sofa, his arm around her shoulders, both of them reading in companionable silence. The marriage that had begun as a rescue had transformed into something neither of them had anticipated, not just love, but true partnership. What are you thinking? Julian asked, setting aside his book. That I walked into a ballroom in a torn dress and walked out with a husband, a fortune, and my life back. She tilted her head to look up at him. Also that my father would have liked you enormously. He always said the measure of a man wasn't his title or wealth, but whether he stood up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Then I hope I've honored his memory. You've done more than that. You've helped me become the woman he believed I could be. She laced her fingers through his. The girl who was banished from the ball thought she'd lost everything. She had no idea she was about to gain the world. Not the world, Julian corrected, pressing a kiss to her temple. Just a somewhat bookish Earl with a talent for legal strategy and a profound appreciation for his wife's magnificence. That, Evangeline said, smiling against his shoulder, is more than enough. Outside, the summer sun climbed higher, gilding the London streets in gold. Inside Sunningdale House, a marriage that had begun with a lie had become the truest thing in both their lives, a partnership forged in fire, tempered by justice, and bound together by a love that had snuck up on them when they weren't looking. The Earl and his Countess sat together in perfect contentment, no longer playing roles or following contracts, simply being themselves. And in the end, that was the greatest triumph of all, not the reclaimed fortune or the social victory, but the freedom to love and be loved exactly as they were. The banishment had ended. The real story was just beginning. My sweet family, Evangeline went from scrubbing floors in her own home to becoming a countess who made society bow to her. Her story ended in triumph, but here's the thing, if you watched this entire journey and don't share it, you're letting it die here. Right now, there's a woman in your life who feels small, who's been told she's worthless, who believes she has no power. Send her this video. Share it to your story. Post it in your book club group. Because stories like this don't just entertain, they ignite. They remind us that we're stronger than the people who tried to break us. So prove that you were really listening. Share this video. Tag someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, click that button. Join us, because next will be more interesting than this one. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.